welcome back to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Florida State and the ACC, a couple of new updates from there. Looks like Florida State has gotten a little bit of momentum after we thought the ACC had gotten a lot of it earlier this week. Then we have a little bit of a draft update for you all. Things are starting to kind of take shape a little bit, only 2 weeks out from the big day, so break down the first round and a couple other pieces from some later rounds that Mel Kiper had in his mock draft this past week. Then we'll get into some biggest needs in the spring transfer portal. Obviously, there are a ton of teams we didn't touch on the first time, so if you do want to check out the first part of that series, it is on the YouTube page, but we'll get to part 2 today. And then we have a Hot Take Thursday, and today we're going to talk a little bit about this UGA offense and what I think they're capable of this year. But first, I want to remind you all that we get a ton of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth. I can answer a question you've been wondering about. You can bring up something that I hadn't brought up in the segment. You can use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a fun kind of interactive experience here instead of kind of just getting talked at by me all day. But definitely, if you want to use that, it's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in. There has been a huge amount of news around the Florida State ACC battle recently. As we know, Florida State and the ACC have had competing cases in either of their states for quite some time now. Ever since the end of last year, really, was when Florida State initially filed their lawsuit and ACC followed suit by countersuing. So all of this thing has been kind of unfolding over the last couple of months, and it's been a little bit stagnant over the last, month or so. There hasn't been a ton of big-time news. Obviously, Clemson joining the fray. But in terms of the Florida State lawsuit, not necessarily anything that has been crazy by any means, but it looks like that is starting to kind of change. Obviously, we talked earlier this week that a North Carolina judge denied a motion by Florida State to get that the lawsuit the ACC had filed in North Carolina to get a stay on that lawsuit so it essentially cannot be tried there. They were denied from that claim, so it looks like that case is going to play out in North Carolina. Now, all of us, including myself, or a lot of people, including myself, definitely thought that this was going to mean that this would be the only case that was going to be tried throughout this process. We thought that the North Carolina was going to be the home base for all of this, and that was that. It turns out that's not the case. So on Tuesday, a Florida State judge the Florida State lawsuit, was brought in front of a Leon County judge in Tallahassee who denied the ACC's attempt to stay the lawsuit there. So essentially, the same exact thing that happened to Florida State in North Carolina is happening to the ACC in Florida. So it shows just how big of a deal it is to get that case filed in your home state, because two very different decisions, two decisions that are obviously do not coincide with each other at all, and it makes the ACC's job just that much harder this next, couple of months, although I think we're quite a ways away from this being settled. But the ACC now has 2 active cases on their hands, and then Clemson is obviously coming up. We're trying to figure out where that's going to be tried. It could follow the same fate. We kind of set a precedent here that I'm sure Clemson would like to continue. The ACC situation just continues to get more tough and more difficult to deal with. It sounds like they are doing their best to kind of keep everything moving forward, but right now they are forced to split their resources. They're forced to split their firepower, their lawyers, their everything that they are going to put forth towards, keeping these 2 schools intact, keeping the ACC a thing for a long time is going to be that much harder, because you can't focus all your power on one case. You can't focus all your energy on one case. And, after the news on Monday that I broke on here, I felt like that was going to be what was going to happen. The ACC was going to be able to set up camp in North Carolina and, fight this on home turf and have the ability to really just kind of unload, clear the bench, as it were, of all the people, all the resources that they have in their disposal. Now it gets a little bit more difficult. Obviously, you have to have people in Tallahassee, you have to have people in North Carolina as well. So this thing just became a lot more complicated with this, and I think the biggest complication of all of this is what happens if both of these cases have different results. We've already seen that these motions have been denied by the separate entities on two different occasions. And so now, what happens if the Florida case comes in favor of Florida State and the North Carolina case comes in favor of the ACC? I really don't know. I got to be totally honest with you. I'm not sure if we would be right back in this position. I'm not sure if Florida State would have a leg to stand on. I'm not sure if these two cases would impact each other. But let's kind of go into that and kind of give an idea of what the options are, obviously. But one of the big things that we've been talking about over this past, couple of weeks talking about this is the exit fee to get out of the ACC. I believe on Monday the number that I said was $572 million. That was the number that a lot of people assumed was going to be the number, and the ACC has made it very, very clear that they are not accepting anything under $700 million. They say $700 million is the number. As of today, at least, that is the number. Obviously, that will drop as the media deal starts to kind of continue on its way, and that number starts to slowly fall. But at the end of the day, the ACC is looking for a big-time payout. There's no two ways about that. It doesn't look like they're in any interest to negotiate that, at least right now. Obviously, a lot of this stuff can change very, very quickly. But the reality is $700 million is just not something FSU is going to give up. It's not something that they'll likely even come to the table for, because it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make financial sense for, 10 different reasons. Obviously, never giving up $700 million is not necessarily something an athletic department wants to do, but also you in the ACC, there is a clause in those agreements that you are not allowed to negotiate with other conferences until you are fully out of the ACC. So until that number is paid, until, paperwork is filed, everything is in order, they no longer, they can't, reach out to the SEC. They can't reach out to the Big Ten. They can't receive calls from those two. So that makes it even more complicated, because it's not only that you're writing a massive check that they probably wouldn't write anyway, to be totally honest with you, but you're writing a check that you're not 100% confident you're going to get back at the pace that you might assume you're going to get back, right? There's this idea that Florida State would just waltz into the Big Ten or the SEC. I've said before, I think it would be the Big Ten, but there's some thought that that would just happen, and they would be able to jump in on the media rights and have no problem. But as we've seen, a lot of the schools that have moved, particularly a couple of the ones that happened a little bit more out of desperation than actual necessity or actual building up, like the SEC building up with Texas and OU. These were a little bit different, but some have had to take substantially less in the media deals for the first couple of years. SMU, I believe, is foregoing that in the ACC for about a decade. So it's remarkable what these schools will do to get into these conferences, and Florida State literally could not do that. If they were to join another conference, especially after giving up $700 million from their pockets, they would not be in a position where they could let a couple of years go by the wayside when it comes to media rights deals. They could not be in a position where they are making anything less than any other school in their conference, because they need to pay back that $700 million somehow, and it's got to happen fairly quickly. But at the end of the day, there's almost no chance that Florida State comes to the table with a $700 million exit fee on the table. There's almost no chance that they give them the ability to kind of do that, because at the end of the day, Florida State is in the position where you're trying to get out as quickly as possible, but also you can't do that if you're going to put your university and your athletic department in a financially impossible situation, which is what this would do. Regardless of what conference you're in going forward, if you're $700 million in the hole and offer and need to owe it to another conference, it's going to be really, really tough to operate. So Florida State is not going to come to the table with that. Clemson absolutely will not come to the table with that. They have a huge problem with the exit fee that is being charged right now. So I don't know. This thing is kind of at a weird point. Obviously, the next hearing for this is on April 22nd, and it's something that I think it'll be really interesting to see how this develops and the kind of agreements that are come to and how all of this shakes out, because as we talked about earlier, both these cases could go two totally different directions. And I tend to believe that if Florida State is able to win the Florida case, that will give them a lot of momentum, and whichever case honestly finishes first might be a huge win for whoever wins that one. I'm honestly not sure. It's a very confusing situation where you have two competing cases that are arguing two different sides that I think have the ability to make two different things happen. So I'm not really sure how all this will shake out, but what I can say is everything just became a lot more complicated for the ACC. We talked about all the cases that are coming up, slowly. Obviously, they have two active cases with Florida State and their own against Florida State. And Clemson just got very excited seeing all this unfold, because if there's a similar decision in South Carolina, then the ACC has 4 cases on their hands. And then, as we've talked about a number of times, the schools kind of on the outside looking in start to kind of come into the fray pretty quickly. So I talked about a little bit, I think on Monday, about how the plan of attack for these schools, if they want to get out of the ACC as quickly as possible, which I'm not really sure how quick that can possibly be, but at the end of the day, the best way to do that is to just make it as messy as possible for the ACC. Make it as confusing as possible, because at the end of the day, Clemson and Florida State and Miami and North Carolina and Virginia and any other school that wants to get involved here, the max number of cases they would have to deal with at a time is 2. They would have to deal with their own. They would have to deal with the countersuit from the ACC. The ACC could have 8 lawsuits on their hands. Quite literally 8 lawsuits. They could have, we've talked about Miami a number of times, although their athletic department has been a little bit more, I want to say hedging in this, kind of saying they're very comfortable in the ACC. I don't doubt that they are watching this very closely, and if they can get into the fray, maybe there's 2 more cases for the ACC, and then North Carolina, maybe there's 2 more cases, or maybe they even lose that one, and things get a little bit more interesting. So I think all of this is going to get very, very interesting. All of this is going to get very messy for the ACC as we get further and further on down this rabbit hole. But at the end of the day, Jim Phillips is a very capable commissioner. He can do a number of very incredible things. But at the end of the day, there's no way that the ACC can come out of this feeling super great. They're not in necessarily the position to really jump off the page. They're not in a position to hold a lot of power right now, but they just got to kick this can down the road. They really do. They absolutely have to elongate this as much as possible, hopefully kind of win the battle if they can in some of these cases, and just kind of continue on, and hopefully you can backfill with some teams as all of this kind of goes down. But at the end of the day, the ACC is attacking something that is unlike anything we've ever seen, and it's only going to get more complicated, and it's only going to get more confusing and more odd. So definitely buckle in. I think this ACC case is going to be very, very interesting, and will set up a precedent that will be very, very weird, and will set off a lot of dominoes around the college football world. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the NFL draft. We talked a little bit about it throughout the week, but there's definitely some big-time updates with some quarterbacks, with a mock draft coming out from Mel Kiper. I want to break all that down for you right after this.